Chapter 29 of Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dan. Chapter 29. This was the theory of Jim's marital evening walks. I made a third on more than one occasion, unpleasantly aware every time of Cornelius, who nursed the aggrieved sense of his legal paternity, slinking in the neighbourhood with that peculiar twist of his mouth, as if he were perpetually on the point of gnashing his teeth. But do you notice how, 300 miles beyond the end of telegraph cables and mailboat lines, the haggard utilitarian lies of our civilization wither and die, to be replaced by pure exercises of imagination, that have the futility, often the charm, and sometimes the deep hidden truthfulness of works of art? Romance had singled Jim for its own, and that was the true part of the story, which otherwise was all wrong. He did not hide his jewel. In fact, he was extremely proud of it. It comes to be now that I had, on the whole, seen very little of her. What I remember best is the even, olive pallor of her complexion and the intense blue-black gleams of her hair, flowing abundantly from under a small crimson cap she wore far back on her shapely head. Her movements were free, assured, and she blushed a dusky red. While Jim and I were talking, she would come and go with rapid glances at us, leaving on her passage an impression of grace and charm and a distinct suggestion of watchfulness. Her manner presented a curious combination of shyness and audacity. Every pretty smile was succeeded swiftly by a look of silent, repressed anxiety, as if put to flight by the recollection of some abiding danger. At times she would sit down with us, and, with her soft cheek dimpled by the knuckles of her little hand, she would listen to our talk. Her big, clear eyes would remain fastened on our lips, as though each pronounced word had a visible shape. Her mother had taught her to read and write. She had learned a good bit of English from Jim, and she spoke it most amusingly, with her own clipping, boyish intonation. Her tenderness hovered over him like a flutter of wings. She lived so completely in his contemplation that she had acquired something of his outward aspect, something that recalled him in her movements, in the way she stretched her arm, turned her head, directed her glances. Her vigilant affection had an intensity that made it almost perceptible to the senses. It seemed actually to exist in the ambient matter of space, to envelop him like a peculiar fragrance, to dwell in the sunshine like a tremulous, subdued, and impassioned note. I suppose you think that I, too, am romantic, but it is a mistake. I am relating to you the sober impressions of a bit of youth, of a strange, uneasy romance that had come in my way. I observed with interest the work of his, good fortune. He was jealously loved, but why she should be jealous, and of what, I could not tell. The land, the people, the forests were her accomplices, guarding him with vigilant accord, with an air of seclusion, of mystery, of invincible possession. There was no appeal, as it were. He was imprisoned within the very freedom of his power. And she, though ready to make a footstool of her head for his feet, guarded her conquest inflexibly, as though he were hard to keep. The very tam-beat-tam, marching on our journeys upon the heels of his white lord, with his head thrown back, truculent and beweaponed like a janissary, with kriss, chopper, and lance, beside carrying Jim's gun. Even Tam-Beat-Tam allowed himself to put on the airs of uncompromising guardianship, like a surly, devoted jailer ready to lay down his life for his captive. On the evenings when we sat up late, his silent, indistinct form would pass and repass under the veranda with noiseless footsteps, or lifting my head I would unexpectedly make him out, standing rigidly erect in the shadow. As a general rule, he would vanish after a time without a sound. But when we rose, he would spring up close to us as if from the ground, ready for any orders Jim might wish to give. The girl, too, I believe, never went to sleep till we had separated for the night. More than once I saw her and Jim through the window of my room come out together quietly and lean on the rough balustrade, two white forms very close, his arm about her waist, her head on his shoulder. Their soft murmurs reached me, penetrating, tender, with a calm, sad note in the stillness of the night, like a self-communion of one being carried on in two tones. Later on, tossing on my bed under the mosquito net, I was sure to hear slight creakings, faint breathing. A throat cleared cautiously, and I would know that Tambitam was still on the prowl. Though he had, by the favour of the White Lord, a house in the compound, had taken wife, and had lately been blessed with a child, I believe that during my stay, at all events, he slept on the veranda every night. It was very difficult to make this faithful and grim retainer talk. Even Jim himself was answered in jerky short sentences, under protest as it were. Talking, he seemed to imply, was no business of his. The longest speech I heard him volunteer was one morning when, suddenly extending his hand towards the courtyard, he pointed at Cornelius and said, "Here comes the Nazarene." I don't think he was addressing me, though I stood at his side. His object seemed rather to awaken the indignant attention of the universe. Some muttered allusions which followed to dogs and the smell of roast meat struck me as singularly felicitous. The courtyard, a large square space, was one torrid blaze of sunshine, and, bathed in intense light, Cornelius was creeping along in full view with an inexpressible effect of stealthiness, of dark and secret slinking. He reminded one of everything that is unsavoury. His slow, laborious walk resembled the creeping of a repulsive beetle, the legs alone moving with horrid industry while the body glided evenly. I suppose he made straight enough for the place where he wanted to get to, but his progress with one shoulder carried forward seemed oblique. He was often seen circling slowly amongst the sheds as if following a scent, passing before the veranda with upward stealthy glances, disappearing without haste round the corner of some hut. That he seemed free of the place demonstrated Jim's absurd carelessness, or else his infinite disdain, for Cornelius had played a very dubious part, to say the least of it, in a certain episode which might have ended fatally for Jim. As a matter of fact, it had redounded to his glory. But everything redounded to his glory, and it was the irony of his good fortune that he, who had been too careful of it once, seemed to bear a charmed life. You must know he had left Doramin's place very soon after his arrival, much too soon, in fact, for his safety, and of course a long time before the war. In this he was actuated by a sense of duty. He had to look after Stein's business, he said, hadn't he? To that end, with an utter disregard of his personal safety, he crossed the river and took up his quarters with Cornelius. How the latter had managed to exist through the troubled times I can't say. As Stein's agent, after all, he must have had Doramin's protection in a measure, and in one way or another he had managed to wriggle through all the deadly complications, while I have no doubt that his conduct, whatever line he was forced to take, was marked by that abjectness which was like the stamp of the man. That was his characteristic. He was fundamentally and outwardly abject, as other men are markedly of a generous, distinguished, or venerable appearance. It was the element of his nature which permeated all his acts and passions and emotions. He raged abjectly, smiled abjectly, was abjectly sad. His civilities and his indignations were alike abject. I'm sure his love would have been the most abject of sentiments, but can one imagine a loathsome insect in love? And his loathsomeness, too, was abject, so that a simply disgusting person would have appeared noble by his side. He had his place neither in the background nor in the foreground of the story. He is simply seen, skulking on its outskirts, enigmatical and unclean, tainting the fragrance of its youth and of its naiveness. His position in any case could not have been other than extremely miserable, yet it may very well be that he found some advantages in it. Jim told me he had been received at first with an abject display of the most amicable sentiments. "The fellow apparently couldn't contain himself for joy," said Jim with disgust. "He flew at me every morning to shake both my hands, confound him, but I could never tell whether there would be any breakfast. If I got 3 meals in 2 days I considered myself jolly lucky, and he made me sign a chit for $10 every week. Said he was sure Mr. Stein did not mean him to keep me for nothing. Well, he kept me on nothing as near as possible. put it down to the unsettled state of the country, and made as if to tear his hair out, begging my pardon 20 times a day, so that I had at last to entreat him not to worry. It made me sick. Half the roof of his house had fallen in, and the whole place had a mangy look, with wisps of dry grass sticking out and the corners of broken mats flapping on every wall. He did his best to make out that Mr. Stein owed him money on the last 3 years' trading, but his books were all torn and some were missing. He tried to hint it was his late wife's fault. Disgusting scoundrel. At last I had to forbid him to mention his late wife at all. It made Jewel cry. I couldn't discover what became of all the trade goods. There was nothing in the store but rats having a high old time amongst a litter of brown paper and old sacking. I was assured on every hand that he had a lot of money buried somewhere, but of course could get nothing out of him. It was the most miserable existence I led there in that wretched house. I tried to do my duty by Stein, but I had also other matters to think of. When I escaped Doraman, old Tunku Alang got frightened and returned all my things. It was done in a roundabout way, and with no end of mystery, through a Chinaman who keeps a small shop here. But as soon as I left the Boogie's quarters and went to live with Cornelius, it began to be said openly that the Rajah had made up his mind to have me killed before long. Pleasant, wasn't it? And I couldn't see what there was to prevent him if he really had made up his mind. The worst of it was, I couldn't help feeling I wasn't doing any good, either for Stein or for myself. Oh, it was beastly, the whole 6 weeks of it. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dan. Chapter 30. He told me further that he didn't know what made him hang on, but of course we may guess. He sympathized deeply with the defenceless girl at the mercy of that mean, cowardly scoundrel. It appears Cornelius led her an awful life, stopping only short of actual ill usage, for which he had not the pluck, I suppose. He insisted upon her calling him father, and with respect too, with respect, he would scream, shaking a little yellow fist in her face. I am a respectable man, and what are you? Tell me, what are you? You think I am going to bring up somebody else's child and not be treated with respect? You ought to be glad I let you. Come, say, yes, father. No? You wait a bit. Thereupon he would begin to abuse the dead woman, till the girl would run off with her hands to her head. He pursued her, dashing in and out and round the house and amongst the sheds, would drive her into some corner where she would fall on her knees, stopping her ears, and then he would stand at a distance and declaim filthy denunciations at her back for half an hour at a stretch. Your mother was a devil, a deceitful devil, and you too are a devil, he would shriek in a final outburst, pick up a bit of dry earth or a handful of mud, there was plenty of mud around the house, and fling it into her hair. Sometimes, though, she would hold out, full of scorn, confronting him in silence, her face sombre and contracted, and only now and then uttering a word or two that would make the other jump and writhe with the sting. Jim told me these scenes were terrible. It was indeed a strange thing to come upon in a wilderness. The endlessness of such a subtly cruel situation was appalling, if you think of it. The respectable Cornelius, Inchinalius the Malays called him, with a grimace that meant many things, was a much disappointed man. I don't know what he had expected would be done for him in consideration of his marriage, but evidently the liberty to steal and embezzle and appropriate to himself for many years, and in any way that suited him best, the goods of Stein's trading company — Stein kept the supply up unfalteringly as long as he could get his skippers to take it there — did not seem to him a fair equivalent for the sacrifice of his honourable name. Jim would have enjoyed exceedingly thrashing Cornelius within an inch of his life. On the other hand, the scenes were of so painful a character, so abominable, that his impulse would be to get out of earshot in order to spare the girl's feelings. They left her agitated, speechless, clutching her bosom now and then with a stony, desperate face, and then Jim would lounge up and say unhappily, Now, come, really, what's the use? You must try to eat a bit, or give some such mark of sympathy. Cornelius would keep on slinking through the doorways, across the veranda and back again, as mute as a fish, and with malevolent, mistrustful, underhand glances. I can stop his game, Jim said to her once. Just say the word. And do you know what she answered? She said, Jim told me impressively, that if she had not been sure he was intensely wretched himself, she would have found the courage to kill him with her own hands. Just fancy that, the poor devil of a girl, almost a child, being driven to talk like that, he exclaimed in horror. It seemed impossible to save her, not only from that mean rascal, but even from herself. It wasn't that he pitied her so much, he affirmed. It was more than pity. It was as if he had something on his conscience while that life went on. To leave the house would have appeared a base desertion. He had understood at last that there was nothing to expect from a longer stay, neither accounts, nor money, nor truth of any sort. But he stayed on, exasperating Cornelius to the verge, I won't say of insanity, but almost of courage. Meantime he felt all sorts of dangers gathering obscurely about him. Doraman had sent over twice a trusty servant to tell him seriously that he could do nothing for his safety unless he would recross the river again and live amongst the bogies as at first. People of every condition used to call, often in the dead of night, in order to disclose to him plots for his assassination. He was to be poisoned. He was to be stabbed in the bath-house. Arrangements were being made to have him shot from a boat on the river. Each of these informants professed himself to be his very good friend. It was enough, he told me, to spoil a fellow's rest for ever. Something of the kind was extremely possible, nay, probable, but the lying warnings gave him only the sense of deadly scheming going on all around him, on all sides, in the dark. Nothing more calculated to shake the best of nerve. Finally, one night, Cornelius himself, with a great apparatus of alarm and secrecy, unfolded in solemn, wheedling tones a little plan wherein for $100, or even for 80, let's say 80, he, Cornelius, would procure a trustworthy man to smuggle Jim out of the river, all safe. There was nothing else for it now, if Jim cared a pin for his life. What's $80? A trifle. An insignificant sum, while he, Cornelius, who had to remain behind, was absolutely courting death by this proof of devotion to Mr. Stein's young friend. The sight of his abject grimacing was, Jim told me, very hard to bear. He clutched at his hair, beat his breast, rocked himself to and fro with his hands pressed to his stomach, and actually pretended to shed tears. "Your blood be on your own head," he squeaked at last, and rushed out. It is a curious question how far Cornelius was sincere in that performance. Jim confessed to me that he did not sleep a wink after the fellow had gone. He lay on his back on a thin mat spread over the bamboo flooring, trying idly to make out the bare rafters and listening to the rustlings in the torn thatch. A star suddenly twinkled through a hole in the roof. His brain was in a whirl, but nevertheless it was on that very night that he matured his plan for overcoming Sheriff Ali. It had been the thought of all the moments he could spare from the hopeless investigation into Stein's affairs, but the notion, he says, came to him then, all at once. He could see, as it were, the guns mounted on top of the hill. He got very hot and excited lying there. Sleep was out of the question more than ever. He jumped up and went out barefooted on the veranda. Walking silently, he came upon the girl, motionless against the wall, as if on the watch. In his then state of mind it did not surprise him to see her up, nor yet to hear her ask in an anxious whisper where Cornelius could be. He simply said he did not know. She moaned a little and peered into the campong. Everything was very quiet. He was possessed by his new idea, and so full of it that he could not help telling the girl all about it at once. She listened, clapped her hands lightly, whispered softly her admiration, but was evidently on the alert all the time. It seems he had been used to make a confidant of her all along, and that she, on her part, could and did give him a lot of useful hints as to Patusan affairs, there is no doubt. He assured me more than once that he had never found himself the worse for her advice. At any rate, he was proceeding to explain his plan fully to her there and then, when she pressed his arm once and vanished from his side. Then Cornelius appeared from somewhere, and, perceiving Jim, ducked sideways, as though he had been shot at, and afterwards stood very still in the dusk. At last he came forward prudently, like a suspicious cat. "There were some fishermen there, with fish," he said in a shaky voice. "To sell fish, you understand." It must have been then 2 o'clock in the morning, a likely time for anybody to hawk fish about. Jim, however, let the statement pass, and did not give it a single thought. Other matters occupied his mind, and besides he had neither seen nor heard anything. He contented himself by saying, "Oh," absently, got a drink of water out of a pitcher standing there, and leaving Cornelius a prey to some inexplicable emotion that made him embrace with both arms the worm-eaten rail of the veranda as if his legs had failed, went in again and lay down on his mat to think. By and by he heard stealthy footsteps. They stopped. A voice whispered tremulously through the wall, "Are you asleep?" "No, what is it?" he answered briskly, and there was an abrupt movement outside, and then all was still, as if the whisperer had been startled. Extremely annoyed at this, Jim came out impetuously, and Cornelius, with a faint shriek, fled along the veranda as far as the steps, where he hung on to the broken banister. Very puzzled, Jim called out to him from the distance to know what the devil he meant. "Have you given consideration to what I spoke to you about?" asked Cornelius, pronouncing the words with difficulty, like a man in a cold fit of a fever. "No," shouted Jim in a passion, "I have not, and I don't intend to. I'm going to live here in Patusan." "You shall die here," answered Cornelius, still shaking violently and in a sort of expiring voice. The whole performance was so absurd and provoking that Jim didn't know whether he ought to be amused or angry. "Not till I have you tucked away, you bet," he called out, exasperated, yet ready to laugh. Half seriously, being excited with his own thoughts, he went on shouting, "Nothing can touch me. You can do your damnedest." Somehow the shadowy Cornelius far off there seemed to be the hateful embodiment of all the annoyances and difficulties he had found in his path. He let himself go. His nerves had been overwrought for days, and called him many pretty names: swindler, liar, sorry rascal, in fact carried on in an extraordinary way. He admits he passed all bounds, that he was quite beside himself, defied all Patusan to scare him away, declared he would make them all dance to his own tune yet, and so on, in a menacing, boasting strain. Perfectly bombastic and ridiculous, he said. His ears burned at the bare recollection. Must have been off his chump in some way. The girl who was sitting with us nodded her little head at me quickly, frowned faintly, and said, "I heard him," with childlike solemnity. He laughed and blushed. What stopped him at last, he said, was the silence, the complete death-like silence of the indistinct figure far over there, that seemed to hang collapsed, doubled over the rail in a weird immobility. He came to his senses, and, ceasing suddenly, wondered greatly at himself. He watched for a while. Not a stir, not a sound. Exactly as if the chap had died while I had been making all that noise, he said. He was so ashamed of himself that he went indoors in a hurry without another word, and flung himself down again. The row seemed to have done him good, though, because he went to sleep for the rest of the night like a baby. Hadn't slept like that for weeks. "But I didn't sleep," struck in the girl, one elbow on the table and nursing her cheek. "I watched." Her big eyes flashed, rolling a little, and then she fixed them on my face intently. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dan. Chapter 31. You may imagine with what interest I listened. All these details were perceived to have some significance 24 hours later. In the morning Cornelius made no allusion to the events of the night. "I suppose you will come back to my poor house," he muttered surlily, slinking up just as Jim was entering the canoe to go over to Doramin's campong. Jim only nodded without looking at him. "You find it good fun, no doubt," muttered the other in a sour tone. Jim spent the day with the old Nakoda, preaching the necessity of vigorous action to the principal men of the Bugis community, who had been summoned for a big talk. He remembered with pleasure how very eloquent and persuasive he had been. "I managed to put some backbone into them that time, and no mistake," he said. Sheriff Ali's last raid had swept the outskirts of the settlement, and some women belonging to the town had been carried off to the stockade. Sheriff Ali's emissaries had been seen in the marketplace the day before, strutting about haughtily in white cloaks and boasting of the Rajah's friendship for their master. One of them stood forward in the shade of a tree and, leaning on the long barrel of a rifle, exhorted the people to prayer and repentance, advising them to kill all the strangers in their midst, some of whom he said were infidels and others even worse, children of Satan in the guise of Muslims. It was reported that several of the Rajah's people amongst the listeners had loudly expressed their approbation. The terror among the common people was intense. Jim, immensely pleased with his day's work, crossed the river again before sunset. As he had got the bogies irretrievably committed to action, and had made himself responsible for success on his own head, he was so elated that in the lightness of his heart he absolutely tried to be civil with Cornelius. But Cornelius became wildly jovial in response, and it was almost more than he could stand, he says, to hear his little squeaks of false laughter, to see him wriggle and blink, and suddenly catch hold of his chin and crouch low over the table with a distracted stare. The girl did not show herself, and Jim retired early. When he rose to say good night, Cornelius jumped up, knocking his chair over, and ducked out of sight, as if to pick up something he had dropped. His good night came huskily from under the table. Jim was amazed to see him emerge with a dropping jaw and staring, stupidly frightened eyes. He clutched the edge of the table. "What's the matter? Are you unwell?" asked Jim. Yes, a great colic in my stomach," says the other, and it is Jim's opinion that it was perfectly true. If so it was, in view of his contemplated action, an abject sign of a still imperfect callousness for which he must be given all due credit. Be it as it may, Jim's slumbers were disturbed by a dream of heavens, like brass resounding with a great voice, which called upon him to awake, awake, so loud that, notwithstanding his desperate determination to sleep on, he did wake up in reality. The glare of a red spluttering conflagration going on in mid-air fell on his eyes. Coils of black thick smoke curved round the head of some apparition, some unearthly being all in white, with a severe, drawn, anxious face. After a second or so he recognized the girl. She was holding a damar torch at arm's length aloft, and in persistent, urgent monotone she was repeating, "Get up! Get up! Get up!" Suddenly he leapt to his feet. At once she put into his hand a revolver, his own revolver, which had been hanging on a nail, but loaded this time. He gripped it in silence, bewildered, blinking in the light. He wondered what he could do for her. She asked rapidly and very low, "Can you face 4 men with this?" He laughed while narrating this part of the recollection of his polite alacrity. It seems he made a great display of it. "Certainly, of course, certainly. Command me." He was not properly awake, and had a notion of being very civil in these extraordinary circumstances, of showing his unquestioning, devoted readiness. She left the room, and he followed her. In the passage they disturbed an old hag who did the casual cooking of the household, though she was so decrepit as to be hardly able to understand human speech. She got up and hobbled behind them, mumbling toothlessly. On the veranda a hammock of sailcloth belonging to Cornelius swayed lightly to the touch of Jim's elbow. It was empty. The Patusan establishment, like all the posts of Stein's trading company, had originally consisted of 4 buildings. 2 of them were represented by 2 heaps of sticks, broken bamboos, rotten thatch, over which the 4 corner posts of hardwood leaned sadly at different angles. The principal storeroom, however, stood yet, facing the agent's house. It was an oblong hut, built of mud and clay. It had at one end a wide door of stout planking, which so far had not come off the hinges, and in one of the side walls there was a square aperture, a sort of window, with 3 wooden bars. Before descending the few steps, the girl turned her face over her shoulder and said quickly, "You were to be set upon while you slept." Jim tells me he experienced a sense of deception. It was the old story. He was weary of these attempts upon his life. He had had his fill of these alarms. He was sick of them. He assured me he was angry with the girl for deceiving him. He had followed her under the impression that it was she who wanted his help, and now he had half a mind to turn on his heel and go back in disgust. "Do you know," he commented profoundly, "I rather think I was not quite myself for whole weeks on end about that time." "Oh, yes, you were, though," I couldn't help contradicting. But she moved on swiftly, and he followed her into the courtyard. All its fences had fallen in a long time ago. The neighbours' buffaloes would pace in the morning across the open space, snorting profoundly, without haste. The very jungle was invading it already. Jim and the girl stopped in the rank grass. The light in which they stood made a dense blackness all round, and only above their heads there was an opulent glitter of stars. He told me it was a beautiful night, quite cool, with a little stir of breeze from the river. It seems he noticed its friendly beauty. Remember, this is a love story I'm telling you now. A lovely night seemed to breathe on them a soft caress. The flame of the torch streamed now and then with a fluttering noise like a flag, and for a time this was the only sound. "They are in the storeroom waiting," whispered the girl. "They are waiting for the signal." "Who's to give it?" he asked. She shook the torch, which blazed up after a shower of sparks. "Only you have been sleeping so restlessly," she continued in a murmur. "I watched your sleep too." "You!" he exclaimed, craning his neck to look about him. "You think I watched on this night only?" she said, with a sort of despairing indignation. He says it was as if he had received a blow on the chest. He gasped. He thought he had been an awful brute somehow, and he felt remorseful, touched, happy, elated. This, let me remind you again, is a love story. You can see it by the imbecility, not a repulsive imbecility, the exalted imbecility of these proceedings, this station in torchlight, as if they had come there on purpose to have it out for the edification of concealed murderers. If Sheriff Ali's emissaries had been possessed, as Jim remarked, of a pennyworth of spunk, this was the time to make a rush. His heart was thumping, not with fear, but he seemed to hear the grass rustle, and he stepped smartly out of the light. Something dark, imperfectly seen, flitted rapidly out of sight. He called out in a strong voice, "Cornelius! Oh, Cornelius!" A profound silence succeeded. His voice did not seem to have carried 20 feet. Again the girl was by his side. "Fly," she said. The old woman was coming up. Her broken figure hovered in crippled little jumps on the edge of the light. They heard her mumbling and a light moaning sigh. "Fly," repeated the girl excitedly. "They are frightened now. This light, the voices, they know you are awake now. They know you are big, strong, fearless." "If I am all that," he began, but she interrupted him. "Yes, tonight. But what of tomorrow night? Of the next night? Of the night after? Of all the many, many nights? Can I be always watching?" The sobbing catch of her breath affected him beyond the power of words. He told me that he had never felt so small, so powerless. And as to courage, what was the good of it, he thought? He was so helpless that even flight seemed to be no use, and though she kept on whispering, "Go to Doraman, go to Doraman," with feverish insistence, he realized that for him there was no refuge from that loneliness which centupled all his dangers except in her. "I thought," he said to me, "that if I went away from her it would be the end of everything somehow." Only, as they couldn't stop there forever in the middle of that courtyard, he made up his mind to go and look into the storehouse. He let her follow him without thinking of any protest, as if they had been indissolubly united. "I am fearless, am I?" he muttered through his teeth. She restrained his arm. "Wait till you hear my voice," she said, and, torch in hand, ran lightly round the corner. He remained alone in the darkness, his face to the door. Not a sound, not a breath came from the other side. The old hag let out a dreary groan somewhere behind his back. He heard a high-pitched, almost screaming call from the girl. "Now, push!" He pushed violently. The door swung with a creak and a clatter, disclosing to his intense astonishment a low dungeon-like interior illuminated by a lurid, wavering glare. A turmoil of smoke eddied down upon an empty wooden crate in the middle of the floor. A litter of rags and straw tried to soar, but only stirred feebly in the draught. She had thrust the light through the bars of the window. He saw her bare round arm extended and rigid, holding up the torch with the steadiness of an iron bracket. A conical, ragged heap of old mats cumbered a distant corner almost to the ceiling, and that was all. He explained to me that he was bitterly disappointed at this. His fortitude had been tried by so many warnings, he had been for weeks surrounded by so many hints of danger, that he wanted the relief of some reality, of something tangible that he could meet. "It would have cleared the air for a couple of hours at least, if you know what I mean," he said to me. Jove, I'd been living for days with a stone on my chest. Now at last he had thought he would get hold of something, and nothing. Not a trace, not a sign of anybody. He had raised his weapon as the door flew open, but now his arm fell. "Fire! Defend yourself!" the girl outside cried in an agonizing voice. She, being in the dark and with her arm thrust into the shoulder through the small hole, couldn't see what was going on, and she dared not withdraw the torch now to run round. "There's nobody here," yelled Jim contemptuously, but his impulse to burst into a resentful, exasperated laugh died without a sound. He had perceived in the very act of turning away that he was exchanging glances with a pair of eyes in the heap of mats. He saw a shifting gleam of whites. "Come out!" he cried in a fury, a little doubtful, and a dark-faced head, a head without a body, shaped itself in the rubbish, a strangely detached head that looked at him with a steady scowl. Next moment the whole mound stirred, and with a low grunt a man emerged swiftly and bounded towards Jim. Behind him the mats, as it were, jumped and flew. His right arm was raised with a crooked elbow, and the dull blade of a kris protruded from his fist, held off a little above his head. A cloth wound tight round his loins seemed dazzlingly white on the bronze skin. His naked body glistened as if wet. Jim noted all this. He told me he was experiencing a feeling of unutterable relief, of vengeful elation. He held his shot, he says, deliberately. He held it for the 10th part of a second, for 3 strides of the man, an unconscionable time. He held it for the pleasure of saying to himself, "That's a dead man." He was absolutely positive and certain. He let him come on because it did not matter. A dead man, anyhow. He noticed the dilated nostrils, the wide eyes, the intent, eager stillness of the face, and then he fired. The explosion in that confined space was stunning. He stepped back a pace. He saw the man jerk his head up, fling his arms forward, and drop the kris. He ascertained afterwards that he had shot him through the mouth, a little upwards, the bullet coming out high at the back of the skull. With the impetus of his rush, the man drove straight on, his face suddenly gaping, disfigured, with his hands open before him gropingly, as though blinded, and landed with a terrific violence on his forehead, just short of Jim's bare toes. Jim says he didn't lose the smallest detail of all this. He found himself calm, appeased, without rancour, without uneasiness, as if the death of that man had atoned for everything. The place was getting very full of sooty smoke from the torch in which the unswaying flame burned blood-red without a flicker. He walked in resolutely, striding over the dead body, and covered with his revolver another naked figure outlined vaguely at the other end. As he was about to pull the trigger, the man threw away with force a short, heavy spear, and squatted submissively on his hams, his back to the wall, and his clasped hands between his legs. "You want your life?" Jim said. The other made no sound. "How many more of you?" asked Jim again. "Two more, Tuan," said the man, very softly, looking with big, fascinated eyes into the muzzle of the revolver. Accordingly, 2 more crawled from under the mats, holding out ostentatiously their empty hands. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dan. Chapter 32. Jim took up an advantageous position and shepherded them out in a bunch through the doorway. All that time the torch had remained vertical in the grip of a little hand, without so much as a tremble. The 3 men obeyed him, perfectly mute, moving automatically. He ranged them in a row. "Link arms," he ordered. They did so. "The first who withdraws his arm or turns his head is a dead man," he said. "March." They stepped out together, rigidly. He followed, and at the side the girl, in a trailing white gown, her black hair falling as low as her waist, bore the light. Erect and swaying, she seemed to glide without touching the earth. The only sound was the silky swish and rustle of the long grass. "Stop!" cried Jim. The river bank was steep. A great freshness ascended. The light fell on the edge of smooth dark water, frothing without a ripple. Right and left the shapes of the houses ran together below the sharp outlines of the roofs. "Take my greetings to Sheriff Ali, till I come myself," said Jim. Not one head of the 3 budged. "Jump!" he thundered. The 3 splashes made one splash. A shower flew up. Black heads bobbed convulsively and disappeared, but a great blowing and spluttering went on, growing faint, for they were diving industriously in great fear of a parting shot. Jim turned to the girl, who had been a silent and attentive observer. His heart seemed suddenly to grow too big for his breast and choke him in the hollow of his throat. This probably made him speechless for so long, and after returning his gaze she flung the burning torch with a wide sweep of the arm into the river. The ruddy, fiery glare, taking a long flight through the night, sank with a vicious hiss, and the calm, soft starlight descended upon them unchecked. He did not tell me what it was he said when at last he recovered his voice. I don't suppose he could be very eloquent. The world was still, the night breathed on them, one of those nights that seem created for the sheltering of tenderness, and there are moments when our souls, as if freed from their dark envelope, glow with an exquisite sensibility that makes certain silences more lucid than speeches. As to the girl, he told me, she broke down a bit. Excitement, don't you know? Reaction. Deucedly tired she must have been, and all that kind of thing, and hang it all, she was fond of me, don't you see? I too. Didn't know, of course, never entered my head. Then he got up and began to walk about in some agitation. I love her dearly, more than I can tell. Of course, one cannot tell. You take a different view of your actions when you come to understand, when you are made to understand every day that your existence is necessary, you see, absolutely necessary to another person. I am made to feel that. Wonderful! But only try to think what her life has been. It is too extravagantly awful, isn't it? And me finding her here like this, as you may go out for a stroll and come suddenly upon somebody drowning in a lonely, dark place. Jove, no time to lose. Well, it is a trust, too. I believe I am equal to it. I must tell you the girl had left us to ourselves some time before. He slapped his chest. Yes, I feel that, but I believe I am equal to all my luck. He had the gift of finding a special meaning in everything that happened to him. This was the view he took of his love affair. It was idyllic, a little solemn, and also true, since his belief had all the unshakable seriousness of youth. Some time after, on another occasion, he said to me, I've been only 2 years here, and now, upon my word, I can't conceive being able to live anywhere else. The very thought of the world outside is enough to give me a fright, because, don't you see, he continued, with downcast eyes, watching the action of his boot, busied in squashing thoroughly a tiny bit of dried mud. We were strolling on the river bank. Because I have not forgotten why I came here. Not yet. I refrained from looking at him, but I think I heard a short sigh. We took a turn or two in silence. Upon my soul and conscience, he began again. If such a thing can be forgotten, then I think I have a right to dismiss it from my mind. Ask any man here. His voice changed. Is it not strange, he went on in a gentle, almost yearning tone, that all these people who would do anything for me, can never be made to understand, never. If you disbelieved me, I could not call them up. It seems hard somehow. I am stupid, am I not? What more can I want? If you ask them who is brave, who is true, who is just, who is it they would trust with their lives, they would say, "'Twan Jim." And yet they can never know the real truth. That's what he said to me on my last day with him. I did not let a murmur escape me. I felt he was going to say more, and come no nearer to the root of the matter. The sun, whose concentrated glare dwarfs the earth into a restless mote of dust, had sunk behind the forest, and the diffused light from an opal sky seemed to cast upon a world without shadows and without brilliance the illusion of a calm and pensive greatness. I don't know why, listening to him, I should have noted so distinctly the gradual darkening of the river, of the air, the irresistible, slow work of the night settling silently on all the visible forms, effacing the outlines, burying the shapes deeper and deeper, like a steady fall of impalpable black dust. "Jove," he began abruptly, "there are days when a fellow is too absurd for anything. Only I know I can tell you what I like. I talk about being done with it, with the bally thing at the back of my head, forgetting. Hang me if I know. I can think of it quietly. After all, what has it proved? Nothing. I suppose you don't think so." I made a protesting murmur. "No matter," he said. "I'm satisfied, nearly. I've got to look only at the face of the first man that comes along to regain my confidence. They can't be made to understand what is going on in me. What of that? Come, I haven't done so badly." "Not so badly," I said. "But all the same you wouldn't like to have me aboard your own ship, eh?" "Confound you," I cried. "Stop this." "Ah, you see," he said, crowing as it were over me placidly. "Only," he went on, "you just try to tell this to any of them here. They would think you a fool, a liar, or worse. And so I can stand it. I've done a thing or two for them, but this is what they have done for me." "My dear chap," I cried, "you shall always remain for them an insoluble mystery." Thereupon we were silent. "Mystery," he repeated before looking up. "Well then, let me always remain here." After the sun had set, the darkness seemed to drive upon us, borne in every faint puff of the breeze. In the middle of a hedged path I saw the arrested, gaunt, watchful, and apparently one-legged silhouette of Tam Tam, and across the dusky space my eyes detected something white moving to and fro behind the supports of the roof. As soon as Jim, with Tam Tam at his heels, had started upon his evening rounds, I went up to the house alone, and unexpectedly found myself waylaid by the girl, who had been clearly waiting for this opportunity. It is hard to tell you what it was precisely she wanted to wrest from me. Obviously it would be something very simple, the simplest impossibility in the world, as, for instance, the exact description of the form of a cloud. She wanted an assurance, a statement, a promise, an explanation. I don't know how to call it. The thing has no name. It was dark under the projecting roof, and all I could see were the flowing lines of her gown, the pale, small oval of her face, with the white flash of her teeth, and turned towards me the big, sombre orbits of her eyes, where there seemed to be a faint stir, such as you may fancy you can detect when you plunge your gaze to the bottom of an immensely deep well. What is it that moves there, you ask yourself? Is it a blind monster, or only a lost gleam from the universe? It occurred to me, don't laugh, that all things being dissimilar, she was more inscrutable in her childish ignorance than the Sphinx propounding childish riddles to wayfarers. She had been carried off to Patusan before her eyes were open. She had grown up there. She had seen nothing. She had known nothing. She had no conception of anything. I asked myself whether she was sure that anything else existed. What notions she may have formed of the outside world is to me inconceivable. All that she knew of its inhabitants were a betrayed woman and a sinister pantaloon. Her lover also came to her from there, gifted with irresistible seductions. But what would become of her if he should return to these inconceivable regions that seemed always to claim back their own? Her mother had warned her of this with tears before she died. She had caught hold of my arm firmly, and as soon as I had stopped she had withdrawn her hand in haste. She was audacious and shrinking. She feared nothing, but she was checked by the profound incertitude and the extreme strangeness, a brave person groping in the dark. I belonged to this unknown that might claim Jim for its own at any moment. I was, as it were, in the secret of its nature and of its intentions, the confidant of a threatening mystery, armed with its power, perhaps. I believe she supposed I could, with a word, whisk Jim away out of her very arms. It is my sober conviction she went through agonies of apprehension during my long talks with Jim, through a real and intolerable anguish that might have conceivably driven her into plotting my murder had the fierceness of her soul been equal to the tremendous situation it had created. This is my impression, and it is all I can give you. The whole thing dawned gradually upon me, and as it got clearer and clearer I was overwhelmed by a slow, incredulous amazement. She made me believe her, but there is no word that on my lips could render the effect of the headlong and vehement whisper, of the soft, passionate tones, of the sudden breathless pause, and the appealing movement of the white arms extended swiftly. They fell. The ghostly figure swayed like a slender tree in the wind. The pale oval of the face drooped. It was impossible to distinguish her features. The darkness of the eyes was unfathomable. Two wide sleeves uprose in the dark like unfolding wings, and she stood silent, holding her head in her hands. End of chapter 32.